Good morning, everybody. It's a great privilege just to think about the things that we're hearing and all the words that are coming at us, and how do we thread those together into the story that God wants us to take with us as we go home. And we start thinking about those things even now and asking God, how can you plant those deeper inside of us? So my hope is that today and tomorrow that this will be helpful for you as you're processing the things you're hearing from God. So over the past 2 days, we've gathered from around North America. We came with energy and excitement. We also came with grief and hurt to stand with each other and to contend for hope, to hope together. We've shared meals, hallway conversations, and we had a 5-minute happy hour yesterday. It was wonderful. We've soaked in prayer, we've been led in song, we've had great teaching. So Christine got us started by framing our time together and sharing vulnerably about her own disabilities and suffering. It is a story that she shared that she has deliberately not chosen to share broadly, to not commoditize. So her choice to share that with us was not only a courageous one, and it is very brave to have your brain on the screen. It was a precious, precious gift. Thank you. Benjamin Wall introduced many of us and reminded all of us to the idea that we are, quote, temporarily abled, and then he proceeded to walk us through the entire book of Job. It was an effort to correct our sight, saying in many different ways, to see someone as disabled is not to see them at all. When I walked in this morning, I saw these flowers. They looked beautiful yesterday, and I thought, well, those really haven't done well, have they? And I thought, we need to get those off the stage because it looks like no one's paying attention. And then I realized these could actually be a beautiful way to hold what we're hearing and what we're seeing. For we are all temporarily abled, and we are beautiful. Benjamin reminded us that it's a death sentence to not name things, to name things wrongly. And he said that hope is the refusal to be silent. It is a willingness to cry out and a recognition that God sees, God listens. That is hope. Love is listening. Love is being a witness to someone's witness. And as you share stories, as you talk and eat and are among each other, you are witnessing someone else's witness. That is love. John Swinton, who Ben helpfully brought to the conversation, has written this, quote, "In order that God's people can become gentle disciples, we will need to learn to accept the gifts that the vocation of those who are so-called disabled bring to us. We will need to learn what it means to become slow disciples. Frenetic disciples may get a lot of things done, but in doing a lot of things, they may miss the very things that God is doing." And if I had walked in and swept these flowers off the stage, I might have missed what God is trying to say to me and to you. I don't want to be frenetic and miss what God is doing. Thank you, Ben. Liuan Huska spoke from her own movement towards being a slow disciple, moving from activism to burnout and learning to live within one's humanity. She gave us a spirituality of limits and offered us the gift of time to reflect on our own relationship to limits. She reminded us that when we push the override button one too many times, eventually our bodies will say no, and this no can come in many forms: headaches, body aches, tightness in the chest, chronic, painful pain. As practitioners of justice and mercy, we live wide-eyed in the starkness of limits. And perhaps limit will be one of the threads that pulls us through our time together. We see the limits of agency, the limits of voicelessness, the limits of legal immigration status, the limits of not having a home, the limits of mental illness, the limits of bodies that crave destructive practices for the sake of numbing their pain. And as practitioners of justice and mercy who are contending for hope, we see Jesus moving among and in the people who carry limits every day. Our work to see, to be amongst that, pushes the limits of what we can hold. That's why we have tears, body pain, sleeplessness. That's why we want to soak in the prayers of others. That's why we want to be reminded that we're not alone and that we are with people who are contending for the same thing. We are all temporarily abled and profoundly loved by the Creator of the universe. May we be aware of his presence among us today. The psalm for this morning was Psalm 119. Let me close this with this. The psalmist says, "Do not snatch your word of truth from me, for your regulations are my only hope." That's my prayer as we weave this together. God, don't snatch the things we're hearing from us. Allow them to go deep in us. For we delight in your commands, we love them, we honor and love the words you say to us, and we meditate on your decrees. May the Lord speak loudly to us today in our time together.
Well, thank you, David, for so helpfully just describing the arc of this narrative that we're weaving together, not just those of us who are up here, but all of you who are sharing your stories with one another and bearing witness to each other's witness. I think those are probably the most powerful spaces where those one-on-one conversations are happening. So I'm hoping you're getting to have some of those and hearing one another's stories and just letting them sink in and soak in and nourish all the little seeds that are being planted. I'm going to give us a little bit of time, just like we did yesterday, to take stock and check in. I know we all had a night of rest. Hopefully it was good. I know the prayer ministers have been praying for a good sleep. But let's just take a moment to close our eyes again, if that feels good for you, and breathe together. God is the one who is closer than our breath. So as you take some deep inhales and exhales, know that the one who made you is nearer than your breath, and that every breath that you take is a sign of God's purpose, God's care, God's love for you, his beloved. Every breath is sustained by the Lord, the giver of life. Take a moment to check in with your bodies. Maybe you want to do a little scan from head to toe mentally. Just say hi to all of your body parts that are keeping you moving and present, that have brought you here to this room with these people. And to just give a little love and attention to those body parts that might be sending signals and telling you something. One more deep breath in together and out together. God who made us and who knows when we rise and when we go to bed, who knows our every thought, and who knows us deeper than we know ourselves. We just turn our hearts over to you again and ask for your Spirit to guide us and nourish us in this time. Amen. So David was describing, we're kind of entering into this space with this naming of our own limits and ways that we are temporarily abled and disabled, and also wanting to rightly name things. And yesterday I spoke with you all a bit about how that might apply to our own work as practitioners. And I want you all to bear with me. We're headed towards hope and towards resurrection and redemption, but I want you all to bear with me a little bit longer as we just be present in the pit and in the trenches. The opening of Psalm 40 in the Message goes like this: I waited and waited and waited for God. At last he looked. Finally he listened. He lifted me out of the ditch, pulled me from the deep mud. He stood me up on a solid rock to make sure I wouldn't slip. He taught me how to sing the latest God song, a praise song to our God. More and more people are seeing this. They enter the mystery, abandoning themselves to God. So this morning, I'd like to talk with you all about persisting with God in the unfinished and the unknown, just like the psalmist is doing in this passage, and just like each one of us will find ourselves in these ditch places, or find ourselves bearing witness to others who are in ditch places at different times in our life and ministry, maybe constantly in our ministry. We or those we are companioning will feel stuck and aimless, like we're doing the same things over and over again without seeing an outward change in circumstances, without seeing the outcomes that we're hoping for. Sometimes we'll feel like we've lost the map, that we've stepped off the trail and lost the narrative arc. We'll feel like we're going in circles. How can we persist in these times of spiritual confusion? The author of Psalm 40 doesn't provide us a map, but the author does provide us with some movements and postures that we can practice and we can accompany others in practicing when we find ourselves in the ditch, in the mud and the muck, where nothing makes sense. So we're going to walk through the progression of those first lines in Psalm 40, these movements of the soul, and just try them out and kind of explore that space. So I'm going to list 5 movements. The first one is waiting and waiting and waiting. And then after some unknown time, number 2, God looks and God listens. And another way to read that would be the psalmist notices that God is looking and listening, and probably has been looking and listening all along, but they might not have been aware of that. And number 3, God lifts the psalmist out of the ditch and places them on a solid rock. Number 4, God teaches the psalmist to sing God's songs. And number 5, the psalmist enters, and it says, with more and more people into the mystery, abandoning themselves to God. So we're going to go through those movements together. So movement 1 is waiting. So in this first movement, we find ourselves with the psalmist in the ditch. This is that unseeing, unfinished place where we don't know what's going to happen next. We feel like we're just below ground and we can't see the road up above us. It's a reality that we find ourselves in a lot, right? And even more so in our times where everything feels so relentless and things feel like they're going from bad to worse to how can this get any worse to it just got even worse. And maybe in your own work and in your communities and in the issues you care about, that feeling is increasing of of disorientation, of I thought we were headed somewhere, but now it seems like we just went backward a bunch of paces. You can't see the way forward, and the suffering just feels unbearable sometimes. I think I've heard this phrase a couple times already this morning from different people: hard to hold, overwhelming. And the issues are so systemic, they feel so intractable, so ingrained, so baked into how our society works, what our society values, even sometimes so baked into our churches. And so you feel like you're in the ditch, in the front lines, in the streets, at the border, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting for God. So first of all, know that you're not alone here. And this gathering is one of those spaces where we can look into each other's eyes and hear each other's stories and say, yes, I see you, and I see how long you've been in the places you've been, and God sees you. This place has been frequented by so many people, so many contenders of hope through space and time. And what you're feeling, that disorientation, that lostness, or maybe what you're companioning someone else in feeling, is absolutely a part of the believer's experience. It's not something that is foreign to the life of faith. One of the goals of this gathering is to make a space for those of us who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness, who are seeking God's kingdom, who are waiting and yearning and groaning together, to accompany one another and say, we're with you, you're not alone. So what are you waiting on God for today? Or what is the ditch that either you find yourself in, or that is just so close to your heart that you're bearing witness to for others? I want to give you a moment to name that, and if you feel comfortable, turn to your neighbor, and you can be as specific or as general as you'd like to name that ditch that you're confronting in your life and in your work. So I'll give you all about a minute to just name that for yourself, and then perhaps, if you feel comfortable, name that to someone around you. So feel free to turn to your neighbor and say hi, say, I'm glad you exist again. So hopefully both or all three, or however many of you have had a chance to share. It's so beautiful to see you all opening up, and I feel like you can probably continue to share for a really long time. So the theme of this year's gathering is contending for hope in dark places. If you're a seeing person, a dark place might convey a sense of lack or maybe even something sinister and lurking about the dark. But if you're an unseeing person, a sight impaired or a blind person, you're used to not being able to see in the dark, and you find other ways to navigate in the dark. You have other senses that come alive and get heightened, and your body becomes more aware of the different objects in the space around you. So what if we came to the dark as not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? These words were part of a prayer written by an Indian American Sikh activist named Valerie Kaur on November 9th, 2016. So Kaur has been part of this movement to share the stories of Muslim and Sikh Americans who have been targeted with increased hatred and misunderstanding since September 11th, 2001. And then on November 9th, 2016, after all these years of telling their stories and fighting and advocating and connecting with communities that treated their communities with fear and mistrust, it seemed to Valerie Kaur like the darkness was closing in again, that things were just going backwards. So let me read you the next words of her prayer. What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all the mothers who came before us, who survived genocide and occupation, slavery and Jim Crow, racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia, political oppression and sexual assault, are standing behind us now, whispering in our ear, "You are brave"? What if this is our great contraction before we birth a new future? Remember the wisdom of the midwife, she says. Breathe and then push. So Kaur is drawing from the wisdom of the body in childbirth. And in Romans 8, which I believe somebody up here just referred to, the Apostle Paul does the same. So in verses 22 through 25, as we all know this verse, Paul talks about a pregnant creation. The difficult times throughout the world are simply birth pangs, he says. So we as part of creation are feeling these pangs, right? We are yearning to be delivered, and we are waiting and trusting that the waiting is not diminishing us. Paul says it's enlarging us. It's preparing us for the transition through the tunnel and into light. So the first movement is waiting and waiting and waiting. And we're waiting in trust and in hope. The waiting is doing something, is part of some greater movement of God that we're all wrapped up in as his creation. And then the second movement is recognizing God's presence in the ditch. So still in verse 1, the psalmist eventually comes to this realization after all this waiting. At last, God looked. Finally, he listened. So in the dark, as I mentioned before, we start to hone our other senses other than sight. And we start to find other ways to navigate these places that seem at first to be innavigable. And we begin to notice that God has been present, maybe in ways that we didn't expect, maybe through people that we didn't expect, and has been accompanying us all along in our pain. But the last thing we want to do when we're in a space of pain and we're in that muck and mire is to stay and pay attention. But in order to get from waiting to noticing God's presence, we're asked to stay. We can't just run away and speed up and get to the good part, the exciting part. My own struggles with chronic pain in my early 20s, as I mentioned last night, landed me in this ditch of mental illness. I had serious depression and anxiety, and it felt like sometimes the only strength I could muster and the only faithfulness I could muster was simply to get up in the morning. And we'll all go through these moments where we feel like the suffering is suffocating, that it's unbearable. When the greatest act of faith we have is just to say yes to God for another day or maybe just another breath. And it's not only our own suffering that we're carrying, it's the suffering of others that we're walking alongside, for whom the blows of life seem relentless. So I want you to know that it is okay to feel depressed and despairing and anxious sometimes. It's normal. Hope isn't false optimism. It's not being cheerful all the time. Sometimes hope is simply saying yes to God and noticing God's presence, saying God is here even if I don't feel like God is here. When the way forward isn't clearly lit and you can't see how you're going to get from point A to point B. So movement 2 is recognizing God's presence. His eyes are upon us, his ear is turned to us, and as those teardrops that medicine showed us yesterday, God is the God who sees. And we might not be able to recognize this all the time. It might feel like a dark night of the soul. That is a very lived-in experience for many saints, many of our ancestors of faith. 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul writes, "We live by faith, not by sight." The Message translation says, "It's what we trust in but don't yet see that keeps us going." So many of you will know the story of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. After she died, it was discovered through some of her papers and journals that she went through these extended periods of darkness and loneliness. It might have even been something she endured for the entire second half of her life. So this woman who ministered to the poor and set up homes for the dying in the streets of Calcutta wrote these words: "The place of God in my soul is blank." And the theologian Frederick Niedner writes about this time in Mother Teresa's life and what ongoing faithfulness looked like for her. "The truest blessing we find, and the only faithfulness we exercise in times of clawing emptiness, may well not come in being able to see an answer to our prayers, but in finding ourselves the embodiments of God's merciful response to another's prayers for mercy." So I want to commend you all as you continue to show up in the trenches, in the ditches of justice and mercy work. You are embodiments of God's merciful response to another's prayers for mercy. And God sees you and hears you as you make it through another day, another week, another month with limited resources and heavy situations and pain and waiting. And God knows what it takes for you to show up to this work. It matters to him. So the second movement is recognizing God's presence, trusting in God's presence when it feels like absence. In movement 3, this is when we get to the exciting part. God lifts the psalmist out of the ditch and onto a solid rock. So this is the moment of transformation. This is the muddy, miry pit becoming solid, something we can stand on. Or if we're going to go with the birthing metaphor, this is the joy, and this is the fear and the pain being transformed into joy and new life. And there are lots of other metaphors we could use. Some are biblical. The grain of wheat going into the ground and becoming a new stalk, or the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. I think we each get tastes of this transformation that are hints of the great redemption of all creation that God is delivering us all into together. But what if you're in the muck and the mire and in that stuck place? How do we allow God to lift us out into the solid place? How do we get unstuck? So in my own experiences with pain, the key has been to work with the pain, or maybe a better way to put it is let the pain work on me instead of resisting it. So I had a really long labor with my first child. He came out at 10 pounds and 7 ounces, so that is probably part of the reason why it was so long. But while I was in the middle of the labor and I didn't know what I was getting on the other side, I was resisting. I had taken these childbirth classes and I knew all of the steps and I knew what I wanted, which was a natural, unmedicated birth. And then one of the lines that our doula gave us kept running through my head as I was having these contractions. She liked to call them waves, which made it feel somehow more bearable, like you were riding a wave. She said to make friends with the heavy feeling of release instead of bracing against the pain. But in order to release, to let the contractions do the work they needed to do on my body, I had to let go of control. I had to surrender what I wanted my body to do to this deeper wisdom. But I had one thing holding me back. My biggest fear in childbirth was pooping. I just really didn't want that to happen. I remember telling my husband, I'm afraid that something's going to fall out of me. And he said, yeah, that's what's supposed to happen. So about 35 hours into labor, ouch, yeah, I did it, eventually. Our midwife told us that she was thinking about giving me Pitocin, which is a hormone that intensifies contractions, so that I wouldn't have to go through another night of labor. I'd been through like 3 nights of labor already, early labor and active labor. And then she gave me another hour to decide and just let things move along on their own. So when she left the room, my husband and my mom and I just sat down and prayed, and in that moment I felt something shift inside my body. So all along I had been bracing against the pain. I had been holding on to control, of wanting to let my body, to just let my body do things as I had in my brain that they were supposed to happen. But I realized with this situation that I would be losing control either way. Either I would take Pitocin and I would be going down this path to a medicated childbirth and lose control in that way, or I would have to let go and just let my body do what it wanted to do. So we started praying and I started crying and I could just feel like my body just kind of go, and I truly melted and embraced that heavy feeling of release. So then a couple hours after that, I pushed my 10-pound, 7-ounce baby into the world. So the educator Parker Palmer writes that we can let suffering do one of 2 things. It can break us open, the way that a seed breaks open, and then the 2 little green leaves come out, reaching for the sun. Or it can break us into pieces, like a vase, shattered on the ground. Which of those that suffering does to us depends on our posture, whether we can let go and surrender, or whether we brace ourselves and resist and harden and try not to feel the pain. And it's natural to want to shy away and protect ourselves from pain. And there are definitely times and places for pain relief. And I'm not saying we go out and seek pain, or that that pain is necessarily good in that theological, ontological sense. But if we let it, God can use pain. And often the role of the church can be to relieve pain, to step into situations where people are suffering, to see if there are ways we can intervene and advocate and interrupt these unjust patterns so that people aren't hurt any further. But on this side of resurrection, there will always be pain. So one of our tasks, too, as the church, is not just to relieve pain, but to walk alongside people, alongside accompanying ourselves through pain, and finding ways to practice holding pain so it's transformative instead of shattering. The priest Henry Nouwen writes that those who follow in the ministry of Jesus are called to help deepen the pain, to bring pain from a personal and individual level to a shared and universal level. So he writes that ministry is a very confrontational service. It does not allow people to live with illusions of immortality or wholeness. It keeps reminding others that they are mortal and broken, but also with the recognition of this condition, liberation starts. And I love that translation of the Beatitudes that Christine put up yesterday, who named God as liberator, and the way that the upside-down kingdom works. Blessed are the hungry, for they will be filled. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. God's power is made perfect in weakness, as Benjamin was saying. So movement 3 is allowing God to work liberation and transformation in us as we go through the ditch, as we let go of our false selves and of the statuses and the narratives and the messages that society tells us about what it means to be strong and powerful and successful, and to embrace the cross and embrace that space of transformation. And then movement 4, God lifts the psalmist out of the pit, and then God teaches the psalmist to sing the latest God song, a praise song to our God. So we might feel like, find ourselves in various parts of these movements, and maybe sometimes we're feeling more than one of these emotions and spaces. But during all of these movements, I think God is also teaching us to sing. We're singing praise songs to God, recalling God's faithfulness, naming God's character and God's gifts. Christine said we're stomping on our lament. We're stomping and turning that into a dance. So to me, this posture is about practicing joy, even when it feels like the darkness is closing in. It's about noticing and naming the things that are beautiful and delightful about God and God's creation, choosing to enjoy and praise and feast, because this is a discipline as much as fasting. So God calls each of us to different aspects of his kingdom work, and we got to see some beautiful videos showing us some of the work that practitioners are doing. I've been drawn in recent years to the work of restoring God's hurting creation. It pains me so deeply to see species going extinct and rivers and oceans polluted with plastic, and then vulnerable human and other than human communities being exposed to all the pollution that we're pumping into our air and our water and our soil. Last year, I reported a story of environmental injustice in my town, which is West Chicago, Illinois. So for decades, a factory was producing radioactive waste. It was actually a supplier for the federal Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project. And they had these piles of this black sand-like material that they didn't have anywhere to put. So they began to offer them to the community as landscaping material. And that went on for decades, from the 30s through the 70s, until the EPA finally stepped in. When the EPA was formed in the early 70s. So I started to listen to these stories of neighbors who had bought contaminated properties unknowingly, children playing in yards with radioactive waste, and then later on, people getting cancer from being exposed, decades of exposure, and not receiving any, little, if any, compensation for all their health costs, because the company had already gone bankrupt, and there was no way to prove directly that someone's cancer was related directly to that exposure, because there's so many factors in why a person can get cancer and their cancer risk. So listening to these stories, every story just brought me deeper into that place into that ditch space of how long, O Lord, will the wicked exalt? How long will they speak with arrogance? How long will the evil people boast? It's into that space of Job, as Benjamin mentioned yesterday, of the innocent suffering and bearing witness and just having my heart break. And right after I published that story, my family and I got on an Amtrak train. We rode across Western United States from Chicago to LA to visit some family, and then we started our family sabbatical in South America. So we spent a year from last July to this July staying at different eco-communities and just getting to see so much beauty, so much of God's good creation. So it was such a contrast going from this place that used to be called the radioactive capital of the Midwest, my hometown, to these beautiful mountains in Brazil, and nothing is pristine these days, but as pristine as you can get these days, these pristine places in Patagonia. It was hard to live these realities side by side, destruction and creation, ugliness and beauty. But just as I had been mourning a tragedy in creation, I felt God's invitation in that sabbatical year to delight and enjoy in God's creation without always needing to do something about it. And so one of the gifts of that sabbatical was learning. After many months, it took me a lot of months of just sitting with that feeling of I need to be productive and I need to be showing that the sabbatical is making some difference or some output, So I was still trying to save the world, but it took me a while, and I finally got to the place of just giving myself permission to simply be and just soak in the good things that God had for me. So I'm back in West Chicago now, and I'm still processing my town's environmental legacy, but I'm also taking the time to notice the wildflowers and the oak trees and the acorns and the beauty even here or there in a place that's been so contaminated and damaged. So that's movement 4, singing and praising and noticing beauty and goodness. And then movement 5, at the end of this passage, the psalmist writes, "More and more people are seeing this. They enter the mystery, abandoning themselves to God." And I love the way that Eugene Peterson words this in the Message translation, but I also love the New Living Translation. It says, "Many will see what he has done and be amazed. They will put their trust in the Lord." So I love that word, amazed. It conveys the sense that this is something I didn't expect. This is something I'm just utterly surprised by. Wow. And that's the thing about being part of this upside-down kingdom of Jesus. The last will be first, the first will be last. The person who starts work in the afternoon gets paid the same amount as the person that started work in the morning. A widow's meager portions is more to God than the lavish offerings put in by the priests and religious leaders. This kingdom doesn't follow the scripts that we've been taught to follow. It doesn't abide by the values that our society has conditioned us to fixate upon. It doesn't operate by the rules of the market or capitalism or any ism. It breaks down our categories, and it breaks down the lines we draw between us and them. It is amazing, it is surprising, it is mysterious. So maybe in your own situation, in your own work, there's been something you've been working towards, waiting for, hoping for as an outcome. Maybe you feel like there's no way forward, or at least no visible way forward. Maybe you're realizing that justice work is something that takes place over generations, and you're not going to see the fruit of your work in your own lifetime. I wonder what it would look like to let go of a particular outcome in your own work. I wonder what it would look like for God to surprise and amaze you. In the book, The Dark Night of the Soul, St. John of the Cross writes, "To get to an unknown land by unknown roads, a traveler cannot allow himself to be guided by his old experience. He has to doubt himself and seek the guidance of others. There is no way he can reach new territory and know it truly unless he abandons familiar roads." And I think that Benjamin was getting to some of this yesterday in his talk as God answered Job. Out of all the 30-something chapters of complaint that Job had, God was saying, look at all this that is strange and unfamiliar and maybe even monstrous to you, and see that I made this and I delight in this, and I'm inviting you into this mystery. As we contend for hope in dark places, God invites us to enter the mystery of that little seed in the ground, or that butterfly, or that caterpillar turning into a butterfly, the mystery of the man on the cross. I think it's going to be painful in the same way that childbirth is painful, that a caterpillar feels obliterated when they're becoming a butterfly. It feels like just a complete loss of identity and self. But I also think it's going to be full of joy and delight and surprises. So I want to give us some time to reflect on what it could look like for each of us to enter into God's mystery. I'm going to read you some questions which are from Christine Walter's Paintner's book, The Soul of a Pilgrim. So in the same way that you listen to Lectio Divina and you listen for something that is speaking to you, that is shimmering to you, I invite you to listen to these questions and just let one of them settle and take root in your soul for the next few minutes. And it may be that you want to open that booklet or journal that you have and write, or maybe you doodle. Maybe you just sit in silence. Maybe you want to get up into the side aisles and let your body take the lead. Oftentimes when we're in the face of these unspeakable things, of these paradoxes, there are no words, but we can find ways to process that don't involve words. So whatever that looks like for you, please feel complete freedom for the next 3 minutes or so to just engage with God as he invites you to abandon yourself to him and enter with each other into the mystery of God. These are the questions. What if our pilgrimage practice courted holy disruption? What if we welcomed in everything that challenges our perspectives on how the world works, which upsets all the plans we made for ourselves and turns them on their heads? What if we embrace the unknown as sacred wisdom for the unfolding of our lives? What if, when life started falling apart, we opened our hearts to welcome in the grief and fear that arrived? What if we considered them as holy guides and windows into the immensity of God? What if all the painful feelings of loss and disorientation were invited in for tea? What if everything that turned our preconceived ideas inside out was precisely where we found God? So again, you can just hold on to a word or a phrase or a question that just shimmers to you, that is just holding some weight for you. And spend the next few minutes in dialogue with God, with words or without words. I'll call us back in a couple minutes. So let's go back to Psalm 40. I waited and waited and waited for God. At last he looked. Finally he listened. He lifted me out of the ditch, pulled me from deep mud. He stood me on a solid rock to make sure I wouldn't slip. He taught me how to sing the latest God song, a praise song to our God. More and more people are seeing this. They enter the mystery, abandoning themselves to God. So I hope that naming these movements and postures of the soul are helpful to you as you navigate your own ditch situations or accompany others as they navigate these situations. We wait with trust. We recognize God's presence. We let the pain break us open instead of break us into pieces. We sing and praise. We recognize beauty, and we find ways to delight. And we enter into the mystery by embracing God's immensity, all the unknowns about God. And as we think about the ways that God is yet to surprise and amaze us, I want to leave you all with one story of such a surprise. It's a story of a woman that I interviewed for my book, Hurting It Whole. The story is of Pat, this woman in her 60s who has lived almost her entire adult life with rheumatoid arthritis and chronic pain. One Sunday after Thanksgiving, Pat was having problems with her knee and could barely move, but she made it to church and she asked her friend Jane, who was experiencing homelessness, if she could take her out for lunch. But Jane didn't want to be beholden to Pat, so instead she told Pat, "I want you to come to lunch with me." And Pat could have thought, wow, this is too weird. What am I getting myself into? But she decided instead to enter into this unknown territory instead of coming up with an excuse to decline the invitation. So she said to herself, "Okay, Lord, let's go. I'm willing to see what this looks like." So Jane and Pat got into Pat's car, and Pat drove them up the hill, this is in Seattle, to another church where they're having a Thanksgiving potluck. And they got into the service before it ended as communion was happening, so Pat came into the back row and she wasn't able to move up to the front, and the pastor saw her and came to the back to give her communion. And then I'll read you the rest of the story in Pat's own words. "Then we get over to the table and sit down. I can't stand up to get a plate. I can't stand up at all, and I'm using a cane, so I can't hold a cane and serve myself. Jane gets me a plate, comes and sits down, and these are all her friends. This is a person who's homeless, and I'm usually seeing myself as the one that's giving. Now I'm in her context, and she's the hostess. She's introducing me to her friends. They don't know anything about me except I'm Jane's friend. It was such a fascinating turning upside down of things. She'd figured out a way for us to be together where I wasn't paying for it. She'd figured out a context that was really comfortable for her with people she cared about who liked her. It was just marvelous. I was totally helpless that particular day, just beyond able to do anything. It took me to a whole other world that I never would have encountered. I met people I never would have met. Jesus talked about banqueting tables. This was a banqueting experience, totally opposite of any that I've ever experienced before." So friends, as we wait and wait and wait for God, and as we show up day in and day out, walking alongside people who society doesn't see, who society has forgotten, may we be able to release our expectations and our scripts that we have for ourselves. May we be able to navigate the darkness and let the pain break us open. May we be able to sing and delight and enter into the mystery that will ultimately lead us to God's banqueting table. Amen.